Hi, my name is Melissa Anderson. I'm here today with Nicholas Troxel. He is a business attorney here in Denver, Colorado. And Nicholas is going to be talking with us today about starting a business in Colorado and entity formation. So let me go ahead and give you a little intro, Nicholas. So Nicholas is a business attorney, but he serves on several sections with the Colorado Bar Association. Right now, he's got his plate full. He's serving on the tax section, the business section, and the solo small firm executive council for all three of those different entities with the Bar Association. And he's also a proud member of the philanthropic arm of the Denver Active 20 to 30. They do charitable work for underprivileged youth throughout Denver. And so, a really nice and worthy community volunteering of mentioning. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and let Nicholas start and tell us all about how to get a small business going. I think a lot of people don't realize that during times of recession, small businesses really crop up and start forming. So thank you so much, Nicholas, for enlightening us on this topic today.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Melissa. I appreciate that very much. So I will go ahead and start sharing my screen now so that we can get into my presentation. So give me just a second. Here we go. And I'll go ahead and jump into that now. So is everything showing up all right on the screen share? It's just the PowerPoint.
It sure is. I see it on my end. So
awesome. So like Melissa said, my name is Nick Troxel. I'm a co-founder of Troxel Fitch LLC. And we are going to be focusing on starting a business. So first, a little legal disclaimer. I am an attorney, so I have to let you know that this is not forming an attorney-client relationship. All the advice I'm giving you in this presentation is just a general perspective on entity formation topics, things about forming a business, but this does not form an attorney-client relationship. For your specific situation, make sure you contact us specifically or a different attorney, and kind of assess your specific situation before taking any action on any of this. So now that we got that out of the way, Troxel Fitch, we're a unique law firm. We really say that we're a law firm built by entrepreneurs for entrepreneurs. The reason we say this is because my law partner and I actually started this firm from the ground up ourselves. So we've, seen a lot of the same challenges, a lot of the same struggles that many business owners have, and we've overcome a lot of those same roadblocks. So our legal advice is really tailored to, specifically helping people kind of overcome those same challenges. And we think it's a unique perspective because, our legal advice is never, we never aim for our legal advice to, be too front heavy in costs or be too overboard in terms of where the situation is, because we recognize that spending too much money on legal fees at the beginning or over bloating with maybe things you don't necessarily need at the outset can derail a business from focusing on what's most important at the beginning, and that's continuing to make money. So we aim to serve businesses through every stage of the life cycle, from formation to exit. That primarily entails the business formation topics we'll discuss today, all types of commercial contract drafting and review, all types of securities and debt financings, as well as mergers and acquisitions and other exits. So kind of just so you can see the rest of the firm. So it's me, Nicholas Troxel. I go by Nick, and then my law partner, Josh Fitch. We are just two guys who met in law school and had the same entrepreneurial passion to help entrepreneurs, and we set out to do this together. So today we'll be talking, the discussion will be broken into basically three pieces. First, we're going to discuss, hey, what do different entities look like, and what do kind of different entity options, how does that affect, how your business is going to operate? Then we're going to talk about, okay, now that we've seen how those, what those entities are, how do you go about actually forming those different entities? And then we're going to touch on one specific topic that's very important from the outset. And that's thinking about, hey, what's going to happen with this business? What is going to happen at the end of this business's life cycle? What am I thinking? How am I wanting to kind of plan from the beginning for what will happen long term, whether it be after I step away, whether I want to exit, all those types of things. So we'll go ahead and dive in.
I have a quick question for you, Nick, as we get started with this slide. What is the biggest mistake that you see business owners make when starting a new business on their own?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so I would say, and we'll dive into this more here, but what I would say is the biggest thing is taking no action, and that's going to result in you fitting into one of these two default entity types. Oftentimes, when business owners start a business on their own, they're not aware of the very kind of simple options that they can use for their entity selection to really reduce their personal liability, make them able to kind of operate the business and focus more on the business without worrying about kind of their personal assets. So I'd say the biggest mistake that people make is simply just not taking enough action and either, getting an LLC or a corporation or something like that. As I'll explain here in a second, the advantages to doing actually filing for an entity as opposed to just using one of these two default entity classifications is going to make a world of difference.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll go ahead and dive in on that. So one of the ones that you hear, one of the entity types that you hear a lot of people operating in is what's called a sole proprietorship. And basically what that is a business where, more or less you're either just operating as, hey, I'm Nicholas Troxel, plumbing, or Nicholas Troxel painting, or I use a trade name, but I'm not actually forming an entity. All I'm doing is operating the business by myself. I'm going out, I'm doing the work. Now, this is a very simple way to go about it. You don't have to file things. The upkeep is more limited, but you are exposed to unlimited personal liability, even if that liability rises from the business, as you can see here.
Right. And what exactly does that mean in layman's terms, if you're exposing yourself to personal liability?
Absolutely, great question. So what that means is if I am operating a sole proprietorship and I have a personal home, let's say I have a $400,000 home, it's totally paid off, I have no loan on it or anything like that. I decide I want to go start let's say I'm starting my plumbing business and I want to go out. I'm working on somebody else's house. I do a big project where, I'm changing a lot of the pipes. I'm doing a lot of different work. Let's say, my work, something happened. I wasn't on the ball that day. Mistakes can happen in any line of work. And let's say in this specific situation, a pipe bursts and there's, $500,000 worth of damage to this mansion that you were working on. Well, if you're operating in a sole proprietorship, the owner of that home will be able to sue you and will be able to come after all of your personal assets for the amount of the liability. So you could
So they
be
could put a lien on your personal home, and that could really affect your family and your ability to provide for your family.
absolutely, yeah. And in certain situations, you could even be forced to sell your personal assets, your home, liquidate savings accounts, stock, and things like that. So it really leaves you very exposed.
Right.
The ultimate downside in that is just so great that it can be very detrimental to operate in that fashion. And kind of just briefly to wrap up the sole proprietorship, in that case, you are taxed personally. So all the income just kind of comes through. You pay for it on your Schedule C, and that's basically it. And you are, as we'll kind of get into later, your tax burden in terms of self-employment tax is going to be fairly high in both of these, sole proprietor and general partnership. So that'll take me into the general partnership. So the thing to keep in mind about a general partnership is it's basically like a sole proprietorship, but it's just when you have two or more persons. Now, keep in mind, these are both default entity classifications. So you don't actually have to file anything. It's just based on how you're operating. So Melissa, if you and I went out and didn't tell anybody anything, but we just started selling, cold brew on the corner, and we're working together, we're selling this, we're making profit. Technically, that could be interpreted as a general partnership because we're two people coming together to work to make profit that we're going to share. So that is a default general partnership entity classification. And the reason that you have to be really concerned about this, even more so than sole proprietorship, in my opinion, is because it similarly has the unlimited personal liability aspect. But not only are you liable for your own acts, you're liable for the acts of the partnership as a whole. So let's say,
Exactly. So if you do something that I don't know about, then I'm responsible for not only my debt that I've incurred, but your debt as well when
yes,
it relates to that, our
yes,
coffee shop business.
right. Going back to the coffee shop example, if you were to go out and bind the partnership to, let's say, hey, we're going to buy $5 million worth of coffee beans, and I didn't know anything about it, even if I didn't agree to it, I'm going to be personally liable for that debt as well. So you really got to watch out. Partnerships are situations that can really get you into even more hot water because you're not only liable for your own acts, but also for the business as a whole. So that is why, and similarly, general partnerships are taxed, basically the same as sole proprietorship. That they're going to, based on your percentage ownership, that money will flow through to you personally, and you'll pay taxes individually like that.
Sounds very risky. I don't know that I would want to take on the risk nor the debt of my partner, especially if they go behind your back and they do something that you're not aware of or something that you don't like, and they make a business decision that really adversely affects you as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it is, it's very risky to operate in either of these. And that's why it's so important that, people kind of understand these concepts so that they know how to take the right steps to avoid one of these two situations. Or at the very least, make sure, hey, if you are going to do, general partnership, especially, you have some type of very robust partnership agreement setting out, decision making and things like that. So that'll bring us to our kind of step into the type of entities. Now, this next piece is going to be limited to just a couple of entities that you can file for. There's a lot of other different specific entities that may work better for your specific situation. But I would say 90 to 95% of the time, these next two that we're going to talk about, LLCs and corporations, are going to be mostly what small business owners are going to go for. But certainly there are other complex forms that could work for you, limited partnerships, limited liability partnerships. Happy to discuss those with anybody who may have a more unique situation. But kind of first taking a look at corporations from this limited liability entities perspective. So the reason that I call these limited liability entities is that corporations and LLCs are actually distinct entities from the person or from the owners themselves. So what this does, so we'll start with the corporation and kind of from a very basic perspective, a corporation is split up, between the individual owners that are called shareholders in this case, and then typically, or the company is going to be run by a board of directors. So those parties aren't always the same parties. You can have, as companies grow, they're typically not. But so it's actually separated like that. And so the shareholders are then actually protected from personal liability from acts of the business. So different from sole proprietor general partnership. If, Melissa, if you and I owned a corporation together, we each owned 50% of the shares. There are some other people who are acting as the board of directors, or even if we were acting as the board of directors, either way, as long as we're operating the business separate and distinct from ourselves, we're going to be protected. Our homes, our personal savings accounts, everything like that are going to be protected from the acts of the corporation. So that's
Seems like it could be a better way to go.
Yeah.
Not like I'm advising anybody to do a certain thing, as you had a disclaimer, I'm also an attorney. So, I would, but
Right.
for myself personally, I would think that this would be the better way to go because I don't have everything else on the line. I can operate my business and not be fearful that it's going to impact my home or my family or my own personal assets. It gives me a nice dividing line between the two, if you will.
Absolutely, yeah, and this is kind of the point that I was stressing in our first slide. It's really a no-brainer, and it's really something. Obviously, I advise you working with an attorney to walk through all this kind of stuff because
Exactly.
That's the way you optimally protect yourself. But at the very least, you have to, at least look into some of these things yourself if you don't, if you feel comfortable doing so. Because operating without an entity in place is really, really a risky move. And it's something you shouldn't take lightly, even though it seems simple to Google things and things like that. You should really trust a professional to make sure these things get locked in for you. But there
Yeah.
are some disadvantages to the corporate form, and that one of the biggest ones is, well, first, it has a little bit less flexible internal governance rules. So state law surrounding corporations just has more rules about, how a company or how a corporation operates, has more restrictions on, how decisions can be made and things like that. But the biggest downside to using a corporation is what's called the double tax, and it's a disadvantageous tax situation. Everybody, as a small business owner, typically wants to avoid paying a ton of tax. So that's really the biggest downside to the corporate form.
Sorry, can you tell me a little bit more about double tax? I'm not familiar with it, so.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the concept behind the double tax is because the corporation is operating as a separate and distinct entity, the corporation is actually has to pay a corporate tax rate. So the money is going to come into the corporation. The corporation itself has to pay tax. Then when the corporation distributes that money to the owners, the shareholders, they're going to have to pay that, they're going to have to pay tax on that money as well. Or if they pay employees, those employees still have to pay tax on that money. So that creates what's called that double tax, because the money is getting hit with tax both at the corporate level and then when it also gets distributed to stakeholders, whether they be shareholders, employees, anything like that. It's going to create that double layer of tax and end up, paying more to the government. So that is a big reason why a lot of people can prefer or would prefer using an LLC. And this is actually, I would say, probably 85 to 95, or probably closer to 90 to 95% of the small businesses we work with. We advise them to start out with an LLC. There's a number of reasons, but one of the biggest ones is that it avoids that double tax. It has what's called pass-through taxation, where basically, similar to a partnership, you're personally paying tax on your percentage of the LLC's income, losses, etc. And the other another advantage. So I guess I'll just rewind just a second, just to kind of differentiate between LLC and corporation. So in a lot of ways, an LLC is similar to a corporation, but instead of being shareholders controlled by a board of directors, the internal governance rules are a lot more flexible. The owners of an LLC are actually called members, and the management of the company can either be in the owners themselves, the members, or they can set it up to be member or manager managed, where you'll actually appoint either one manager or kind of a board, similar to the board of directors, to kind of act on behalf of the company. Similarly, the owners are protected, their personal assets are protected from the acts of the business. But the big advantage is that it has much more flexible internal governance rules. More or less, the LLC, you can basically set it up to operate however you want, absent fraud. I mean, it's so flexible, and the law is set up so that you can really, have kind of creative ways of how things are run, how money is distributed, and things like that. As long as you're not setting things up, to where someone's allowed to do fraudulent acts or anything like that, you're basically good to go on most things with the LLC. So that's why it's so attractive. It can, it's hard to screw up. You can make it simple, you can make it complex. It really fits the, wide range, as well as, sometimes in our work with startup clients specifically, or others who are trying to raise money from sophisticated angel investors or venture capitalists, most of those investors are always going to demand that they invest in a corporation. But because corporations are more costly to maintain, it might not always make sense to start from a corporation to begin, but you can start with an LLC and convert to a corporation, and it's going to be a tax-free transaction. So it will cost you a little bit more in legal fees, but at that point, if you're having investors who are willing to invest money in your company, but all you need is to do a corporation, it's going to be well worth the fees to switch over, and it may have saved you quite a bit of money in the long run because you don't want to be paying tax or dealing with the cost of maintaining the corporation for the long term.
Right. For a small business, it might make sense for them to start in that LLC, and as they develop and as they grow, they can always go ahead and switch over to more of the corporate structure. But like you said, that'll save them money on their taxes in the long run.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
It can be a great, it can be a great way to allow the business owners to show some proof of concept before having to dive in and make those kind of increased fees.
And really, you don't want to grow, you don't want to go for the whole shebang all at the outset. So growing so quickly, starting as a corporate structure, having that double tax, that could be a really burdensome on that small business entity. So I like your idea of the transition from the LLC eventually to the corporate structure.
Yeah,
Makes
I
sense.
advise people to, the corporation isn't really necessary until you either A, start having serious investor interest, or B, you're really starting to, you have a minimum viable product and you're really making a fundraising push and you're, going out pitching VCs. Until that time, it's really not totally necessary to do so.
Right.
So, one of the things that a lot of, because taxation is something that small business owners, worry about, nobody likes to pay more taxes. I think we can agree to that. I think that most people are, no matter which way you feel about taxes, if everything could exist, and we could have nice roads and everything and pay less taxes still, I'm sure everybody would like that route. So, I wanted to point out just a specific tax election that we advise a lot of small business owners to make, just because it's going to save you a pretty substantial amount on taxes. It's called an S Corp tax election. And so what this is kind of just very briefly, when you're thinking about your entity, you want to think about it in two ways. You have your state law entity classification type. That's what you're going to form with whatever state your business is in, Colorado, Delaware, Nevada, wherever you set up or wherever you kind of choose to have your entity formed. You're going to have those internal governance rules we've discussed. That's going to separate between corporation, between LLC, general partnership, sole proprietor, things like that. But for the IRS, they only view entities, in a very limited number of ways. For the most part, they're going to look at businesses as either a disregarded entity, a partnership, a corporation, or an S corporation. So either, a disregarded entity basically is sole proprietorships, single member LLCs, and it's basically saying, hey, we're almost not even seeing this entity for tax purposes. You just pay taxes personally. Partnerships, multi-member LLCs, partnerships, things like that, they're going to pay tax based on this partnership tax model, which can get pretty complex. Then the corporate tax, that's where you're paying your corporate tax rate, and there's, you're getting that double tax. The S corporation tax election kind of fits into a hybrid. In a lot of ways, it's similar to the partnership tax model, where, if Melissa, you and I own each 50% of either a partnership or an S corporation, and the corporation makes $100,000, we're going to each pay tax on $50,000 of that because we each own 50%. The difference between the S, and that's both for partnership and S corporation similarly.
Is that considered bifurcating your income?
So the bifurcation is actually the piece that really kind of sets the S corp apart. Is as a partnership, all the money that's coming in, you're paying self-employment tax on it. So an example I like to use is, most people are familiar with getting paid on a W-2 basis. So you get your normal paycheck and you see your gross pay and then you see your net pay. So that's actually the amount of Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security taxes that your employer has withheld from your paycheck and pays to the government. What you don't actually see is that your employer is paying a matching portion out of their own pocket towards the government to cover those taxes. So in total, there's being paid a 15.3% tax. In a W-2 situation, you're paying half of it and your employer is paying half of it. Now, when you're a business owner, specifically in the partnership model, you have to pay that full 15.3% on all of your earnings. So you're going to end up paying quite a bit in tax because you're paying that self-employment tax as well as your income tax. So you can start paying close to, 35, close to 40% at times. This is why you can hear a lot about realtors or other kind of solo service providers who come to tax time and have this huge tax liability and have to kind of scramble to pay their taxes. So one way you can minimize this a little bit is by making an S Corp tax election. What this allows you to do is the money that's coming into your S Corp, you can actually pay yourself as an employee, but you can also pay yourself as an owner. So the money
Okay.
that goes to yourself as an owner is not going to be subject to that self-employment tax. And you're going to end up saving, we usually estimate roughly, if you were to make $100,000, you'd save about $8,000 in tax. So
Yeah. What's the disadvantage of that? Why doesn't every small business owner go ahead and make that S Corp election? It seems like that would be the way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So the biggest thing is that the distributions out of the S Corp have to be equal based on your percentage ownership. So let's say, again, you and I own the business 50-50. We can't, if I distribute $10,000 to myself as an owner, I have to distribute $10,000 to you as well. So it doesn't allow you to have as much flexibility as the partnership model in terms of distributing money based on, especially in kind of service provider situations. You may have a month where you bring in quite a bit more money while I'm working on something else, and then vice versa, the months down the road. It may not make sense to pay us equally on those different months. So, there are other options to that. You can set it up in a more complex structure with potentially a partnership owned by two S corporations. There's a lot of things that you can do to try to minimize that. But I would say that's the biggest reason why people may not want to do the S corporation route. In addition to, there's a lot more restrictions on what is eligible to be an S corporation. So I'll dive into those now.
Okay.
So the eligibility requirements can limit people from wanting to make the S Corp election too. First off, it has to be owned by individuals. So while you can have an LLC owned by an S Corp, you can't have an S Corp owned by an LLC. So it simplifies the ownership structure that you're eligible to have. And you can't have more than 100 shareholders, as you see here. You can't have more than one class of stock. So oftentimes, if you're seeking investment, the S corporation model also isn't going to be a good route because most investors are going to want some kind of, preferred stock or preferred shares to have, rights to, preferred returns and things like that. Now, one thing to point out is that this is just a small piece. Having voting and non-voting stock, as long as they have the other same rights, that's typically going to be fine. Obviously, your specific situation may change things, but that's the basics of why S corporations may not be advantageous. Not being able to do the same, or not being able to be flexible with the distributions, not being able to have more kind of complex entity structures, and really just kind of generally not being an attractive vehicle for sophisticated investors to invest in. This is much more of a model for small service provider businesses. Typically, what we see the most advantageous is for single kind of solopreneur service providers. So we've advised, other attorneys, accountants, things like that, that this route is really a good route.
Okay.
So now just jumping into how you actually go about forming the entities. So this is, more or less the corporation you file for both of the entities that you actually form. You're going to file articles, either articles of incorporation or articles of organization with the Secretary of State. It's a pretty simple document that just sets out, the name, the address, and different things like that to keep on public record. And then a real key piece to maintaining your limited liability is actually having good internal documents in place. So for a corporation, that's going to be, bylaws, shareholders agreement, and some board resolutions. For LLC, you're going to want those operating agreement, the member manager resolutions. Those are really important because, and so this is a situation where a lot of times people may ask, hey, can I use LegalZoom or something like that to basically get these agreements in place? Now,
that comes up a lot, doesn't it? People are always asking about LegalZoom. Should I just go ahead and do this? Maybe it's the cheaper option.
Yeah. And so, and I will say this, I think that LegalZoom can have its place in very specific circumstances. I am not a big fan of it. I think that the biggest problem with using LegalZoom is that that's viewing the kind of legal documents you have as just a placeholder and something that you just need something in place. You just need an operating agreement in place or something like that. That's really not how you should be viewing your business and the internal documentation needed to make sure you're protected. One of the biggest things with this limited liability, protecting yourself personally, if you were ever to be sued, a court's going to want to see that you are operating the business separate and distinct from yourself. So you really need to have well-drafted internal documents like this, setting out how the business is going to operate, how decisions are going to be made, so that you can clearly show, hey, we set up rules from the beginning. We've been operating according to those rules. I understand what those rules are. We've been distributing money in that fashion, so that you can really show that, hey, this business was separate and distinct from myself personally. So the biggest thing the problem I see with LegalZoom is that people download and use documents. They don't understand what's in the documents. They make changes to the documents that they don't understand what they're doing. And they end up putting themselves in a position to where if they were sued, it's more, the risk increases that the courts could do what's called piercing the corporate veil and determine that, hey, you had this entity in place, but you weren't actually operating it as a business. You were basically just operating it as a shell of, yourself, and come after your personal assets anyway. So I think it's really important to just stress, hey, if you're, sophisticated and you understand these legal documents, maybe LegalZoom is a good fit. But when the whole reason that you're kind of filing for an LLC, the whole reason that you want to use an entity as opposed to just kind of freewheeling with a sole proprietorship, is to make sure that you're protected. So to me, it's always kind of confusing when I see people who, hey, the whole reason you're doing this is to protect yourself personally, but now you're trying to kind of, save a couple $100, when in the long run, it's more about, hey, let's make sure you don't totally lose your business. Let's make sure you don't lose your house.
Right.
So I think
is the couple $100 really worth the fact that you might be held personally liable, and you wouldn't be able to provide for your family? You'd have a lien on your house. There's a lot of, it could just be like an avalanche of all of your personal finances then have to flow back into that business. And again, what you said with the piercing the corporate veil, some people might not understand. If they do one or two things where they're using their own personal finances to pay for the business, there you go. You've now opened yourself up to some form of personal liability because you're not treating your business as a separate entity.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's one of the things that's so, that why we believe so strongly in working with an attorney. And I know that's somewhat self-serving in a way, but there's so many things that go into maintaining the limited liability, and they're not complex things, but working with an attorney to help you form the entity, to help you put together your documents, and to help advise you on how to operate the business on an ongoing basis is going to protect you, and is ultimately going to make sure that, hey, when you start making money through your business, you actually get to keep that money. You don't lose your house. You don't lose everything else. It's really more so about, hey, let's make sure that you get to keep what you work hard for, and not let, cost cutting on the front end ruin that.
And expose you to a lot of liability. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So jumping in, the kind of just one final piece. So, you're going to want to also get a EIN, and this kind of goes in line with what I was talking about. This is basically your company's social security number. You're going to want to get this because, again, that sets it up as separate and distinct from your personal self. So again, just a really necessary piece to have there. Um, so jumping into kind of what I view as a really critical piece at the outset of a business, especially when you're working with co-owners. You really need to think about this, and I'll just touch briefly on kind of one of the basic things we do. But the business succession planning, specifically figuring out, hey, from the beginning, if something happens to me, if something, if you have partners, if something happens to me or my partners, if we have a disagreement, if, one or both of us is married and we get divorced and the business interests get tied up in that, if we get disabled or anything like that, you really need to have one of these buy-sell agreements in place from the beginning to account for that. What this basically does is it says, and you can set it up to have as many or as few triggers as you want, but more or less what this says is, hey, if certain events happen, if one of us declares bankruptcy, or if we get divorced, or if we die, or we're disabled, or we get, if we're divorced and a divorce court gives, my ex my shares in this company, or anything like that, if we eventually reach a disagreement where we can't move the business forward and one of us needs to kind of buy the other one out in order to kind of move forward with the business, this is really a very, very critical piece to always have at the outset. We've had multiple clients who, are in business for a few years, or, even longer than that, decades, and one of them gets divorced. Now all of a sudden, somebody's wife or something like that is now an owner in the business. And, that person may have good intentions, but they really don't know about the business or how to, continue making it profitable and things like that. And really
Right,
just,
exactly. So can you contract, can you arrange this buy-sell agreement to prevent something like that? What happens, you just mentioned one scenario that could happen when a business doesn't have a buy-sell agreement in place, but what other benefits really are with the buy-sell agreement?
yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the one I discussed, the biggest piece I think is the just continuity of the business. So whether there's a death or a disability or a divorce or something like that, I mean, think about it from the perspective of you and your buddy are, operating this business. You each own it 50-50. Everything's going well. God forbid your friend gets in a car accident. So now let's say, he didn't die, but he's disabled. He can't continue to operate the business. You're going to want to make sure, hey, look, you've been in here with me. You've built up the profitability of this business. I want to make sure you're taken care of. I want to make sure your family is taken care of. So we're going to buy you out of this company to be able to provide you liquidity, to be able to provide you, kind of compensation for all the hard work you've helped me build this business. But it's clear at this point, either through death or disability, that you can't, you're never going to be able to kind of operate and help out in this business anymore. So it helps to cash you out.
Right,
You know,
right. It's so interesting because I imagine a lot of business owners don't really plan from the beginning what could happen at the end of the life cycle of their business. So it's sort of contingency planning, if you will. And I myself am an estate planner. And so I do see this a fair amount of, where I will have business owners that say, how can I work this into my estate plan? And I always refer them to business attorneys because it should be outside of the estate plan. We don't need to work in our business planning within our own personal private estate planning. Again, there you go with that corporate veil situation. Keep that business separate from your personal assets and plan on the back end for that with this buy-sell agreement. I really think that's a smart thing to get in place.
Absolutely. And kind of on the flip side, I mean, we always advise when people are doing this as well. Hey, as we're setting up the buy sell, as we're, setting up your business and things, it's really smart to also loop in, the estate planning personal side and at least have that open lines of communication because they really, are synergistic in that, when we set up these things, it's good to let have them work with an estate planning attorney as well to make sure, they're aware of, hey, we have these agreements with respect to the business because it's very holistic. I mean, nobody knows when their day is coming, whether it be, death or a severe accident. And we don't like to dwell on those things, but it's one of those things that you have to address. And not addressing it isn't going to make it not happen. You have to
Right.
for these
And
things.
where this may really come into interplay is if you have a family business. There you go. So you have this, oh, my brother is going to get the business. If I pass away, I'm going to leave it to him in my estate plan. No, leave it to him in that buy-sell agreement. Make, do all this in your business planning. So that's spelled out. You might make a mention and refer to it in the estate plan that there is a separate, corporate buy-sell agreement, and also, or maybe the LLC has a buy-sell agreement. Maybe they also have some sort of, bylaws that you would want anyone to look at within the family. Other people think that they might get a piece of the business. No, that's already been taken care of in your business plan. So I think this is such a great idea for small businesses, family-owned businesses, things like that, to go ahead and look at the future and say, how will we want things to play out for someone to buy another family member out of the business? It's a great idea.
Absolutely, yeah. Now I'll just put in one more piece here. One of the things that's also really great to think about is, okay, so if we're gonna, if in the 50-50 circumstance, I'm buying my partner out, if one of these events arises, one of the things that you should also consider is, okay, how is that going to be financed? Because typically a company is not going to have liquid cash up to like even 20% of its value just on hand at any time that it can just pay you out. If our company is valued at 10 million, we're likely never going to have 5 million liquid cash. We can just pay you out in one lump sum. So there's a number of ways you can set that up. Obviously, you can do flexible payout terms, payout over a number of years. But one thing that's really can be a good idea is you can set up life insurance policies or other kind of insurance vehicles that you basically pay into over the course of a number of years, so that if any of these events happen, that policy cashes out and is able to buy out that partner kind of in full at that time. So that can be really advantageous and something that people may want to consider as well, because it doesn't derail the business in terms of limiting cash flow, but it also allows for, especially in situations with death, at least for most people, the people that they're in business with, they care about a lot and their lives are very intertwined. So not only are you, not derailing the business, but you really get to, help out that family who's just gone through a tragedy, someone that you've, built this business with over a number of years. You want to do all you can to make sure that they're set and they can kind of continue on. So again, really a really important piece of setting things up. We actually, in our packages, when we work with people for our business formation packages, this is always something that's included in our LLC operating agreements, and always something that we advise putting in place in the corporate formations as well. So that's everything I got for you today. Obviously, we are always open to chat more if you'd like to discuss. We do provide free 30-minute consultations to anyone who would like to discuss business formation or maybe any other issues you have with your business. I will put one more pointer in there. We do also provide real estate transaction services. So if you have questions about investment properties and putting those in entities, or buying or selling properties as well, that is also in our wheelhouse. I'd love to chat and hear from you soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate such an informative discussion. I know I learned quite a few things as well. And just for people to know, this is also available on demand. So if you feel like this discussion that Nicholas and I had today might help or assist another friend of yours that owns a business in the area, we'd happy if you'd pass this along. My name is Melissa Doherty Anderson. I'm an estate planner, and you can also find me at www.coloradoestateplanner.com. Thank you so much, Nick, for your time today. I really appreciate it. Such a great discussion.
Thanks for having me, Melissa. I
Yeah.
really appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.